You think you know the story. Sir Walter Raleigh. Explorer, poet, soldier, the Queen's favorite, a man of the Renaissance, facing the axe with a final, witty word, but the brutality of his end wasn't in the sharp edge of the blade. It was in the 13 years it took for the axe to fall. The real story isn't about one morning on a scaffold. It's a slow-motion political execution, orchestrated by a paranoid king, fueled by foreign gold, and sealed with the blood of his own son. This wasn't justice. It was an assassination, scheduled for October 29th, 1618, but it began the moment Queen Elizabeth took her last breath. You are standing in the crowd at Westminster, watching a dead man walk. How did he get here? Why does the most famous man in England have to die? The answer is a lesson in power. What happens when your protector dies, and the new ruler fears your shadow more than he wants your service? If you value documented history like this, pulled from the original records, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this story. This script is built on verifiable facts, drawing from the detailed trial transcripts found within the Bagot Papers, cross-referenced with the analysis by historian Mark Nichols in his 2018 work, Sir Walter Raleigh, in Life and Legend, and the eyewitness diplomatic dispatches of the time, particularly those of John Chamberlain and Dudley Carleton. Now back to the story. The end begins on March 24th, 1603. Queen Elizabeth I is dead. For over 40 years, she was England, and Raleigh, he was her man, her water. He held lucrative monopolies on wine, cloth, and tin. He was captain of the Yeomen of the Guard, Lord Warden of the Stannaries, Governor of Jersey. He lived in the magnificent Durham House on the Strand. He was rich, powerful, brilliant, and arrogant, and his enemies, led by the hunchbacked, ruthlessly intelligent Robert Cecil, had waited patiently for this day. The new king, James VI of Scotland, now James I of England, was on his way south to London, and James was a different man. He was a scholar, but he was also deeply insecure, terrified of conspiracies, and desperate for peace with England's old enemy, Spain. Raleigh represented everything James distrusted, the swashbuckling, popular, anti-Spanish war hero of the old Queen's court. Within weeks, the axe began to fall, not on his neck, but on his life. In May 1603, James strips Raleigh of his captaincy of the guard, a personal humiliation. Then he takes his wine monopoly, the core of his income. Finally, he's ordered out of Durham House, which is given to a bishop. Raleigh, the Queen's favorite, is homeless, jobless, and sidelined. But Robert Cecil wasn't finished. Sidelining Raleigh wasn't enough. He needed to be removed, permanently. The tool for this removal would be a supposed plot, a flimsy conspiracy known as the Main Plot. The accusation was pure poison. The government claimed Raleigh had conspired with his friend Lord Cobham to overthrow King James and place the king's cousin, Lady Arabella Stuart, on the throne. And who was funding this treason? Spain. The price for Spanish support was religious tolerance for Catholics in England and a hefty bribe for the plotters. The key witness against Raleigh was Cobham himself, a weak, unstable man who was interrogated without counsel and terrified into a confession. He signed a statement implicating Raleigh, and that was all they had, one man's word. A man who, from his own cell in the Tower, would soon retract his entire story. November 17th, 1603, the trial is moved from London to Winchester to avoid the plague. The Great Hall of Winchester Castle is packed. Raleigh is brought before a panel of commissioners, a jury already convinced of his guilt, and a prosecutor who loathed him. That prosecutor was Sir Edward Coke, the Attorney General, a brilliant legal mind, but a vicious, merciless man in the courtroom. The trial that follows is a legal travesty. Under the law of the time, the accused could not call witnesses in his own defense. He could not have a lawyer, and most importantly, he had no right to confront his accuser. Raleigh repeatedly demands that Cobham be brought to the court to testify in person. "Let my accuser come face to face and be deposed," he pleads. The judges refuse. Coke opens his attack with pure venom. He doesn't present evidence. He hurls insults. "Oh, thou art a monster," he screams at Raleigh. "Thou hast an English face, but a Spanish heart." He calls him the most vile and execrable traitor that ever lived. Raleigh, composed and articulate, defends himself with astonishing skill. He dissects the single, pathetic piece of evidence, Cobham's retracted confession. He points out the logical fallacies, the inconsistencies. He explains that Cobham, in a letter smuggled from the Tower, had completely exonerated him, writing, "I protest upon my soul, and before God and his angels, I never had conference with you in any treason. But Coke has an answer for that too. He produces another, later statement from Cobham, once again implicating Raleigh, likely extracted under more pressure. The entire case rests on a battle of paper. On the words of a man not even in the room, Raleigh speaks for hours, his cool logic and eloquent defense winning over almost everyone in the hall. Spectator after spectator noted that by the end of the day, a man who had entered the court hated for his arrogance had become a figure of sympathy and admiration. But it didn't matter. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The jury took only 15 minutes. Guilty. The Lord Chief Justice pronounced the sentence. It was the full Idaho. Horrific punishment for a traitor. You were to be hanged, but cut down alive. Your entrails and genitals were to be cut from your body and burned before your eyes. Only then would you be beheaded, and your body cut into 4 quarters, to be displayed at the king's pleasure. Sir Walter Raleigh, the hero of Cadiz, listened to this sentence in complete silence. The execution was set, but King James hesitated. Executing the last great Elizabethan, a man still popular with the people, on such flimsy evidence, was a risky move, days before he was due to die. Raleigh was granted a reprieve. The sentence wasn't cancelled, it was suspended. He was to be imprisoned in the Tower of London, indefinitely. He was 51 years old. The bloody tower became his world for the next 13 years. This wasn't a simple dungeon. As a high-status prisoner, he was granted relatively comfortable quarters. His wife, Besses, and his son, Wat, were allowed to live with him for several years. His second son, Carew, was born there in 1605. He was allowed books, visitors, and even a small furnace in a shed where he could conduct chemical and alchemical experiments, developing distillates and cordials. He turned his prison into a study, and here he undertook his most ambitious project, writing a history of the entire world from creation to his own time. The book, The History of the World, published in 1614, was a monumental achievement. It was also a subtle political critique of the monarchy, drawing parallels between ancient tyrants and the current court of King James. The king was not pleased. He tried to suppress it. But the book was a massive success. From his prison, Raleigh was still a towering public figure, a living ghost of a more glorious age. But 13 years is a long time. His health failed. His fortune was gone. His estates given to the king's new favorites. He was aging, forgotten by a new generation. He needed a way out, and he had one last, desperate card to play. A legend. A city of gold. El Dorado. For years, Raleigh had been obsessed with the idea of a golden empire hidden deep in the jungles of Guyana, in what is now Venezuela. In 1595, he had led an expedition there himself, exploring the Orinoco River. Now, he proposed a second voyage. He would sail to the Orinoco, locate a specific gold mine he claimed to know of, and bring back treasure for the bankrupt English crown. He promised he could do it without angering the Spanish, who claimed the entire region as their own. King James was broke. The idea of Spanish gold was tempting, but he was also terrified of upsetting the delicate peace with Spain. The Spanish ambassador in London, the powerful and cunning Count Gondomar, was a constant presence at court, whispering in the king's ear. Gondomar demanded that Raleigh not be released. He called him a pirate, a heretic, a man of blood. James came up with a compromise that was, in fact, a death trap. He would release Raleigh to go on his voyage, but he gave him an impossible condition. Raleigh was forbidden, under pain of death, from engaging in any act of hostility against any subject of the King of Spain, and to make sure Raleigh couldn't simply turn pirate and disappear. James did not pardon him. He was released from the Tower, but the 1603 death sentence still hung over his head. If he failed, if he broke the rules, the old treason charge would be reactivated, and the axe would finally fall. James even shared the details of Raleigh's route and the size of his fleet with Gondomar, who promptly sent warnings to the Spanish colonies in the New World. Raleigh was sailing into an ambush. He knew it. Everyone knew it. It was a final, suicidal gamble. In June of 1617, Raleigh's fleet of 14 ships sailed from Plymouth. He was 65 years old, a frail man who had spent more than a decade indoors. The voyage was a catastrophe from the very beginning. They were hit by violent storms that scattered the fleet. Disease swept through the ships, killing dozens of men, including Raleigh's second-in-command. By the time they reached the coast of South America, the expedition was already in shambles. Raleigh himself was so sick with fever he couldn't stand. He couldn't lead the party up the Orinoco River to the supposed mine. So he stayed with the main fleet at the river's mouth and gave command of the inland expedition to his most trusted captain, Lawrence Keymis. And with Keymis, he sent his 23-year-old son, Wat. His last instruction to Keymis was a desperate plea: avoid a fight with the Spanish at all costs. Keymis led 5 ships and 400 men up the twisting, jungle-choked waterway. What they found near the supposed location of the mine was not gold, but a fortified Spanish settlement called Santo Tomé de Guayana. It was a forward outpost, built to block any foreign access to the interior. It was a tripwire. The Spanish had been warned. They were waiting. On the night of January 2nd, 1618, the English landed. A battle erupted in the darkness. Who fired first is lost to history. But the English stormed the town, and in that first chaotic assault, Walter Raleigh, Sir Walter's beloved son, was shot and killed. Keymis pushed on, taking the settlement, but he found no gold. He spent the next 3 weeks frantically searching the jungle, but the mine was either a fiction or impossible to find. He had failed. He had gotten the boy killed, and he had broken the king's direct command. He had to go back and face Raleigh. The news shattered the old man. His son was dead. The expedition was a failure. The king's orders were violated. He was, legally, a dead man. He turned on Keymis with savage grief. "You have undone me," he raged. "You have cost me my son and my fortune." Keymis, consumed by guilt, tried to explain, to apologize. Raleigh would not listen. He told Keymis he would not support his story back in England. Broken, Keymis returned to his own ship. He went to his cabin, took a pistol, and shot himself in the chest. The bullet only cracked a rib. Still alive, he took a knife and forced it into his own heart. The expedition collapsed into mutiny and despair. The surviving crews wanted to turn pirate and attack the Spanish treasure fleet. Raleigh, now a ghost of a commander, had no choice but to sail for home, to face the music. He knew exactly what was waiting for him. Gondomar in London was screaming for his head. King James had already declared him a pirate and issued a warrant for his arrest. Raleigh's ship landed in Plymouth in June of 1618. He made a half-hearted attempt to escape to France, but he was betrayed by his own cousin, Sir Lewis Stucley, who was paid to hand him over. He was arrested and brought back to London, back to the Tower. The trap, so carefully set 2 years earlier, had snapped shut. If you believe that the truth of history lies in these brutal details, subscribe. It's the best way to support telling these stories. Let us know in the comments if you think Raleigh ever truly believed he would find gold. Our research for this section draws heavily on the modern reevaluation of Raleigh's final years, particularly Anna Beer's 2012 biography, Patriot or Traitor: The Life and Death of Sir Walter Raleigh, which masterfully untangles the political web woven by King James and Ambassador Gondomar. Now, back to Raleigh's final days. There would be no new trial. A trial for piracy or for attacking the Spanish would be diplomatically inconvenient. It would require presenting evidence, and that evidence might prove that the Spanish had fired first, or that the king himself had tacitly approved of a more aggressive mission than his official orders stated. It was much cleaner, much simpler, for the government to fall back on the old sentence. On October 22nd, 1618, a group of commissioners met and declared that, as Sir Walter Raleigh had broken the conditions of his release, his original death sentence for treason from 15 years ago was now to be carried out. The charge he would die for was not his actions in Guyana, but the ghost of the main plot. It was a legal fiction, a piece of political theater to appease the Spanish and remove a troublesome icon. On October 28th, he was moved from the Tower for the last time, taken to the Gatehouse prison at Westminster Abbey to spend his final night. He wrote a last, heartbreaking letter to his wife, Bess. "My love I send you, that you may keep it when I am dead, and my counsel, that you may remember it when I am no more. I would not with my will present you with sorrows, dear Bess. Let them go into the grave with me and be buried in the dust." He ate a good breakfast, smoked a final pipe of tobacco, the plant he had helped make popular in England, and prepared himself for the end. The morning of October 29th, 1618, a scaffold had been erected in the old palace yard at Westminster, a public space between Westminster Hall and the Abbey. A large crowd had gathered in the damp autumn air. Shortly after 8 o'clock, Raleigh was brought out. He was 66 years old now, but he walked firmly, dressed in a black satin doublet, a black taffeta waistcoat, and a fine ruff. He looked, one observer noted, like he was going to a wedding. He was allowed to give a final speech from the scaffold. He spoke for nearly an hour, his voice weak from his recent fever, but clear and steady. He calmly refuted the old treason charges. He explained what had happened on the Orinoco, defending his actions and mourning his son. He asserted his loyalty to the king and to England. He finished his speech and prepared to die. He handed his hat and a silver watch to an acquaintance. The executioner came forward and, as was custom, asked for his forgiveness. Raleigh placed a hand on the man's shoulder and forgave him with a smile. He then asked to see the axe. He ran his thumb along the edge. "This is a sharp medicine," he famously said, "but it is a physician for all diseases and miseries." He handed it back, and after a moment of private prayer, he laid his head upon the block. He gave the signal, but the executioner hesitated, perhaps awed by the man before him. Raleigh, lying on the cold wood, had to command his own death. He called out, "What dost thou fear? Strike, man, strike!" The executioner struck, but the first blow was not clean. It wounded him terribly, but did not sever his head. A gasp of horror went through the crowd. The executioner had to strike a second time to finish the job. He then held the head aloft, its famous gray hair matted with blood, and proclaimed, as was custom, "Behold, the head of a traitor." But the crowd was silent. They knew they had not watched the death of a traitor. They had watched the state-sanctioned murder of a great Englishman. The brutality was not just the 2 blows of the axe. It was the 13 years in a cage. It was the public humiliation. It was the calculated mission that sent his son to his death. It was the cynical revival of a 15-year-old lie to justify a political killing. But the story has one last, brutal postscript. The king allowed Raleigh's body to be taken by his wife for burial. He was laid to rest that same day at the nearby church of St. Margaret's, or at Westminster, but his head was not buried with his body. By her own request, Bess Raleigh was given her husband's head. She had it embalmed. She placed it in a red leather or velvet bag. And for the next 29 years, until the day she died, she kept it with her always. The final, silent witness to a king's betrayal. The head was passed down to their son, Carew, and was finally interred with him upon his death. The state took his life. His wife kept the conversation going.